They thought they were about to witness a thief being exposed, but before the afternoon was over, an entire crowd would be forced to confront its own assumptions. Naomi Brooks stepped through the glass doors of the Grand Crescent Mall in downtown Manhattan with the careful exhaustion of someone running on almost no sleep. The bright afternoon sunlight reflected across the marble floors and luxury storefronts, creating a world that felt far removed from hospital hallways and overnight shifts. Naomi adjusted the strap of the leather handbag resting on her shoulder and glanced down at the small gift box she carried in her hands. It was wrapped in silver paper with a blue ribbon she had tied herself during a quiet moment in the hospital break room. Tomorrow morning, her 8-year-old daughter, Ava, would undergo heart surgery. For months, Naomi had worked extra shifts, skipped meals, and accepted every available hour the hospital offered. The gift was not expensive. It was a small music box Ava had admired months earlier while passing a store window. Yet to Naomi, it represented something much larger. It represented hope. It represented a promise that life would continue beyond tomorrow. She smiled softly as she remembered her daughter's voice. Ava had called the music inside the box the sound of courage. Naomi's phone vibrated. A text message appeared on the screen. It was a photograph from Ava. The little girl sat in a hospital bed, holding a handmade card decorated with uneven hearts and bright markers. Beneath the photo was a simple message. "Love you, Mom. See you soon." Naomi stopped walking for a moment and pressed the phone gently against her chest. Around her, shoppers carried designer bags and discussed dinner reservations. Nobody noticed the woman standing quietly in the middle of the crowd, holding onto the most important thing in her world. She carefully slipped the phone back in her handbag and continued toward the exit. A few floors above the main atrium, in a private executive lounge overlooking the mall, Adrian Kong stood beside a glass railing reviewing business reports. The successful Korean businessman rarely paid attention to the activity below. People came and went every day. Stores opened. Stores closed. It was simply part of the rhythm of the city. Yet as he looked down across the atrium, his attention briefly settled on a woman in light blue medical scrubs carrying a small wrapped gift. Something about her expression stood out. She looked tired but determined, concerned but hopeful. Adrian returned his attention to the reports in his hand. Below, Naomi moved through the center of the atrium, unaware that the ordinary afternoon she had planned was seconds away from changing completely. She tightened her grip on the gift box and quickened her pace. All she wanted was to reach the hospital before visiting hours ended. All she wanted was to see her daughter smile. But fate often arrives without warning. And somewhere inside the crowded shopping center, another woman had already noticed Naomi, already noticed the handbag on her shoulder, and already begun making a decision that would soon place an innocent mother at the center of a public humiliation she never saw coming. Naomi Brooks was only a few steps from the main exit when a sharp voice cut through the noise of the shopping center. "That is my bag." The words echoed across the atrium with enough force to stop conversations and turn heads. Naomi froze instinctively. Before she could even process what had happened, a well-dressed woman in an expensive cream-colored coat moved directly toward her. The woman pointed at the leather handbag hanging from Naomi's shoulder. Her expression was filled with certainty, the kind that immediately attracts attention. "I've been looking for that bag everywhere," she said loudly. "I knew someone had taken it." Within seconds, shoppers slowed their pace. Several people stopped completely. Others instinctively reached for their phones. Naomi stared at the stranger in confusion. "Excuse me?" she asked. The woman folded her arms. "Do not pretend you do not know what I'm talking about." Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She looked around at the gathering crowd and suddenly became aware of how she appeared. Her hospital scrubs were slightly wrinkled after a long shift. Her hair was pulled back simply. She carried a practical handbag and a small gift box. Beside her, the woman looked as though she had stepped out of a luxury fashion advertisement. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "Ma'am, this is my handbag," Naomi said carefully. "No, it is not," the woman replied immediately. "I purchased one exactly like it this morning." The confidence in her voice began influencing the people nearby. A man standing beside a jewelry store frowned. Two women exchanged skeptical looks. Nobody knew the truth, yet opinions were already forming. Naomi felt a wave of frustration rise inside her, but she pushed it down. She did not have time for this. Ava was waiting. The hospital was less than 30 minutes away. Every delay mattered. I am sorry, Naomi said calmly. But you are mistaken. The woman laughed. Not kindly, not politely. It was the kind of laugh designed for an audience. Mistaken, she repeated. Then perhaps you can explain why the bag looks exactly like mine. More people gathered. The circle around them widened. Naomi glanced toward the exit. For the first time all afternoon, she felt trapped. Above them, Adrian Kong happened to look up from his reports again. The growing crowd caught his attention. He noticed the woman pointing aggressively. He noticed Naomi standing alone. Most importantly, he noticed something in Naomi's expression. She was not angry. She was worried. Deeply worried. Adrian set the reports down and walked toward the glass railing overlooking the atrium. Below, the woman took another step forward. If that bag belongs to you, she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, then you should not mind proving it. The crowd grew quieter. Naomi tightened her grip on the small wrapped gift. She suddenly realized this was no longer a misunderstanding between two strangers. It had become a public spectacle. And somewhere in the growing silence, the first pieces of a much larger injustice were beginning to fall into place. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Sterling, and the moment she spoke her name, several people in the crowd seemed to recognize it. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. That confidence made the situation even harder for Naomi Brooks. Victoria pointed toward the handbag again. If you have nothing to hide, then show everyone what is inside. Naomi felt dozens of eyes settle on her. She hated the attention. She hated the judgment forming in strangers' minds. Most of all, she hated losing precious minutes she should have been spending with her daughter. I do not need to prove anything to strangers, Naomi said quietly. Victoria smiled as if she had expected that answer. Interesting. The single word spread through the crowd like fuel. A few people exchanged knowing looks. Others began whispering. Naomi could almost hear the conclusions being drawn around her. She was tired. She was wearing scrubs. She was carrying a luxury-looking handbag. For many people, that was apparently enough information. A security guard finally arrived and approached the gathering. What seems to be the problem, he asked. Victoria answered before Naomi could speak. She took my handbag. The guard looked at Naomi. His expression remained professional, but Naomi immediately recognized the subtle doubt behind it. She had seen similar looks before. Not openly hostile, just quietly suspicious. Ma'am, the guard said, would you be willing to help clear this up? Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She knew refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, she placed the handbag on a nearby marble bench. The crowd moved closer. Victoria stepped forward immediately. Too quickly, almost eagerly. Naomi noticed it. So did Adrian Kong from above. The businessman remained at the railing overlooking the atrium. Something about Victoria's behavior continued bothering him. Most people trying to recover lost property felt relieved. Victoria seemed excited. There was a difference. Below, the handbag was opened. Naomi's personal belongings became visible one by one. A wallet, hospital identification, a notebook filled with handwritten reminders, a bottle of hand lotion. The crowd watched with uncomfortable curiosity. Then a folded piece of colorful paper slipped from one of the compartments and landed on the floor. Naomi's face changed instantly. Please be careful with that, she said. Her voice carried more emotion than anything she had said so far. Victoria picked up the paper. It was a handmade card decorated with hearts, stars, and uneven handwriting. Before Naomi could stop her, Victoria opened it. The inside read to Mom, thank you for being brave when I am scared. I love you forever. Love, Ava. The noise of the crowd seemed to disappear. Naomi gently took the card back and pressed it against her chest. For the first time, the exhaustion she had been carrying all day became visible. My daughter made that, she said softly. She's having heart surgery tomorrow morning. Several people lowered their eyes. Others suddenly looked uncomfortable. The story they thought they were watching no longer felt so simple. Naomi carefully gathered the card and placed it beside the small wrapped gift. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply protected the things that mattered most. Above the atrium, Adrian watched her closely, and in that moment, he became certain of one thing. Whatever was happening here, Naomi Brooks was not the person the crowd should be questioning. The atmosphere in the atrium shifted almost imperceptibly after Ava's card appeared. The crowd was still watching, but the certainty that had filled the space a few minutes earlier had begun to fade. People were no longer looking at Naomi Brooks as though she were guilty. They were looking at her as though they were not quite sure what to think. For Naomi, that uncertainty offered little comfort. Every passing minute was another minute she was not spending with her daughter. She carefully placed the card back inside her handbag and checked the wrapped music box to make sure it had not been damaged. The small gesture revealed where her priorities truly were. Not the accusation, not the crowd, not her own embarrassment. Ava. Everything was Ava. Do you have a receipt for the handbag? The security guard asked. Naomi immediately nodded. Yes, I bought it this morning. Relief briefly crossed her face. Finally, something simple. Something factual. She reached into the inside pocket of the handbag, where she clearly remembered placing the receipt. Her hand searched once, then twice. The relief disappeared. Naomi checked another compartment, then another. Nothing. A small knot formed at her stomach. The receipt should have been there. She remembered folding it carefully after making the purchase. She remembered sliding it into the pocket, yet somehow it was gone. Victoria Sterling noticed the hesitation instantly. A satisfied smile touched the corners of her mouth. That is convenient, she said loudly. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. The mood began shifting again. Doubt was returning. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. I know I had it, she said quietly. I purchased the bag this morning. Of course you did, Victoria replied. That is exactly what someone would say. The comment drew a few uncomfortable laughs from nearby shoppers. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not because she doubted herself, because she could feel the judgment settling over her once more. Above them, Adrian Kong continued watching from the balcony. Something about the missing receipt bothered him. Not because receipts disappeared. That happened all the time. What bothered him was Victoria's reaction. She looked relieved, almost pleased. It was the reaction of someone who expected the receipt to be missing. Adrian's attention sharpened. He stepped away from the railing and began moving toward the private elevator that connected the executive level to the main floor. Down below, Victoria folded her arms confidently. Without proof, this seems very straightforward. Naomi looked at the exit doors across the atrium. Beyond them was the city. Beyond the city was the hospital. She imagined Ava waiting for her. She imagined the little girl asking if she was coming soon. The thought hurt far more than the accusations. Naomi took a slow breath and tried to remain calm. She refused to lose her composure. She refused to become the angry person the crowd seemed to expect. Yet as she stood surrounded by strangers deciding who she was, she could not shake the feeling that this was never really about a handbag. Somewhere above the crowd, Adrian stepped out of the elevator and entered the main atrium. For the first time since the confrontation began, he was no longer watching from a distance. He was walking directly toward the center of the storm. Adrian Kong crossed the marble floor with an unhurried confidence that immediately changed the atmosphere around him. Several employees recognized him at once and stepped aside without being asked. Conversations faded. Even the crowd seemed to sense that someone important had entered the situation. Naomi Brooks barely noticed at first. Her attention remained fixed on a handbag and the missing receipt that should have ended this entire ordeal. Victoria Sterling, however, noticed immediately. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she quickly hid it behind another confident smile. Adrian stopped near the security guard and calmly surveyed the scene. He looked at the scattered personal belongings, the small wrapped music box, and finally the handmade card resting beside it. Unlike everyone else, he did not begin with accusations or assumptions. He began with observation. What happened? He asked. The security guard explained the situation in a few sentences. Victoria interrupted several times, eager to reinforce her version of events. Naomi remained silent. Adrian noticed that as well. Most innocent people became defensive when publicly accused. Naomi seemed more concerned with leaving than proving herself right. His attention returned to the card. The uneven handwriting and colorful decorations stood out among the polished luxury of the shopping center. "Your daughter made that?" he asked. Naomi looked surprised by the question. Nobody else had asked about Ava. They had questioned the handbag, the receipt, her honesty, but not her child. "Yes," Naomi answered softly. "She is waiting for me at the hospital." Adrian nodded slowly. Something in her voice carried a sincerity that could not be manufactured. Victoria folded her arms. "With all due respect, that has nothing to do with ownership." Adrian turned toward her. "Perhaps, but character often has something to do with truth." The crowd grew quieter. Victoria looked uncomfortable. For the first time since the confrontation began, she was no longer controlling the conversation. Adrian crouched beside the bench and carefully examined the handbag. His eyes settled on a small engraved identification mark near the clasp, a detail so subtle most people would never notice it. Yet Adrian recognized it immediately. Earlier that morning, one of the luxury boutiques inside the mall had received a limited collection shipment. He remembered approving the inventory himself. The mark indicated the handbag came from that collection. A thought formed in his mind. He stood and looked toward one of the store managers who had quietly arrived during the commotion. "Contact the boutique that sold this collection today," Adrian said. "Retrieve the transaction records." The manager nodded immediately and hurried away. Victoria's expression tightened. Naomi looked confused. "I did not understand," she said. Adrian met her eyes. "If you purchased the handbag this morning, the store can confirm it." For the first time in nearly an hour, a small measure of hope appeared on Naomi's face. It was fragile, but it was there. Across the atrium, the crowd waited in silence. The accusation that had seemed so obvious only minutes ago was beginning to feel far less certain. And somewhere beneath Victoria's carefully controlled expression, the first real signs of fear were starting to emerge. The wait felt endless even though only a few minutes passed. Naomi Brooks stood beside the marble bench with her handbag close to her side, her eyes drifting repeatedly toward the glass entrance of the shopping center. Beyond those doors was the city. Beyond the city was the hospital where Ava was waiting. Every minute stretched painfully. She imagined her daughter checking the clock in her hospital room and wondering why her mother had not arrived yet. The thought hurt more than the accusations ever could. Nearby, Victoria Sterling appeared increasingly restless. She checked her phone. She glanced toward the exits. She adjusted the strap of her designer purse several times. Most people would not have noticed. Adrian Kong did. The behavior did not match someone confidently waiting to prove ownership of a handbag. It matched someone worried about what might happen next. The crowd remained gathered around the scene. Nobody seemed eager to leave anymore. At first, they had expected entertainment. Now, they were witnessing something else entirely. Doubt had entered the story, and doubt had a way of changing everything. A store manager finally returned carrying a tablet. He approached Adrian immediately. "The boutique record, sir." The atmosphere became completely still. Adrian accepted the tablet and reviewed the information displayed on the screen. Rows of transactions appeared. Dates, times, product identification numbers, customer information. He scrolled once and stopped. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes sharpened. Victoria noticed and visibly tensed. Adrian handed the tablet to the manager. "Read transaction number 3127. The manager swallowed nervously. "Limited collection leather handbag. Sold today at 9:14 in the morning." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. That was exactly when she remembered making the purchase after finishing part of her shift. The manager continued reading. Customer name, Naomi Brooks. The words settled over the atrium like a sudden silence after a storm. Several people lowered their phones. Others looked away in embarrassment. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Relief washed through her, but it was mixed with exhaustion. She should never have been forced to prove something that was true from the beginning. Victoria immediately stepped forward. That proves nothing. Her voice sounded thinner now, less confident, less convincing. Adrian looked at her calmly. It proves the handbag belongs to Naomi Brooks. Nobody argued. Nobody supported Victoria. For the first time since the confrontation began, she stood completely alone. The security guard shifted his attention away from Naomi and toward Victoria. The change was subtle, but everyone noticed it. Adrian returned the tablet to the manager. There is still one question. Victoria's face tightened. What question? Adrian folded his hands. The missing receipt. Naomi looked up. She had nearly forgotten about it amid everything else. The receipt she distinctly remembered placing inside her handbag. The receipt that had somehow vanished. Adrian's gaze moved briefly toward Victoria's purse, then back to her face. You seemed remarkably confident the receipt would not be found. Victoria said nothing. Around them, the crowd grew quiet again. A new realization was beginning to form. If Naomi had truly purchased the handbag, then why had the receipt disappeared at exactly the moment it was needed most? And why did Victoria suddenly look as though she already knew the answer? The realization spread through the crowd slowly at first, then all at once. Naomi Brooks had purchased the handbag. The boutique records proved it. Yet the missing receipt remained unexplained. Adrian Kang watched Victoria Sterling carefully. Experience had taught him that people often revealed the truth through small reactions long before they spoke a word. Victoria's confidence was disappearing. She kept adjusting the strap of her purse. She kept glancing toward the exits. Most importantly, she kept avoiding eye contact whenever the missing receipt was mentioned. Adrian turned toward the security guard. I would like to review the camera footage from the last 30 minutes. The guard nodded immediately. Within minutes, a monitor from the customer service desk was positioned where everyone could see it. The crowd gathered closer. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. The story had changed. This was no longer about a handbag. It was about discovering why an innocent woman had been publicly accused. The footage began playing. Naomi watched silently. She hated being the center of attention, but she could not look away. The first recordings showed her entering the shopping center, carrying the handbag and gift box. Nothing unusual. Then another camera angle appeared. This one showed Victoria standing near a decorative column several minutes before the confrontation. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Victoria seemed to notice Naomi from across the atrium. Instead of continuing on her way, she stopped. She watched Naomi. Then she changed direction and began following her through the mall. A murmur spread through the crowd. The footage continued. Victoria remained behind Naomi at a distance. She watched her enter one store, then another. She watched her stop too. Answer a text message. She watched her almost the entire time. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief. She had never seen Victoria before that afternoon. Yet Victoria clearly knew exactly who she was looking for. The next camera angle appeared. This one showed Naomi briefly setting her handbag on a bench while adjusting the wrapped gift. A few seconds later, Victoria walked past. The angle was not perfect, but it showed Victoria slowing beside the handbag before continuing. Then the footage ended. The crowd became silent. Nobody needed a confession to understand what they had just seen. Victoria had not randomly encountered Naomi. She had selected her. Adrian looked toward Victoria. You followed her. Victoria immediately shook her head. That proves nothing. Yet her voice no longer carried certainty. It carried fear. Adrian remained calm. Out of hundreds of people in this building, you chose one woman. Nobody spoke. A woman wearing hospital scrubs. A woman carrying a child's gift. A woman alone. Victoria looked away. Naomi felt something inside her sink. Throughout the entire ordeal, she had believed she was trapped in a misunderstanding. Now she understood something far worse. Victoria had never mistaken her. She had targeted her. The realization hurt more than the accusation itself. And as the crowd slowly absorbed that truth, the balance of the entire afternoon shifted. For the first time since this began, every question in the room was no longer directed at Naomi Brooks. They were directed at Victoria Sterling. The silence inside the atrium felt heavier than any argument that had come before it. Nobody was looking at Naomi Brooks anymore. The suspicion that had followed her throughout the afternoon had finally disappeared. In its place stood something far more uncomfortable. Regret. The crowd had watched an innocent woman defend herself while they quietly chose sides. Now they were being forced to confront that choice. Victoria Sterling stood motionless near the customer service desk. The confidence that had carried her through the confrontation was gone. Even the way she held herself had changed. She no longer looked like someone controlling a story. She looked like someone trapped inside one. Adrian Kong remained calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The evidence had already spoken. You followed her, he said quietly. You watched her. Then you accused her. Victoria opened her mouth as though searching for an explanation, but none came. Around them, several people exchanged uneasy glances. The sequence of events was impossible to ignore. Naomi had been selected long before the accusation was made. The realization settled over the crowd with uncomfortable clarity. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. She thought about Ava sitting in her hospital room. She thought about the handmade card folded safely inside her handbag. Most of all, she thought about how close she had come to spending the entire afternoon questioning herself because strangers had been willing to believe the worst about her. A mall employee suddenly approached Adrian carrying a small folded piece of paper. Sir, he said carefully, we found this near the decorative column shown in the footage. Adrian accepted it and unfolded it. Naomi immediately recognized it. The missing receipt. A murmur swept through the crowd. The timestamp matched the boutique purchase. The item description matched the handbag. The final piece had returned. Naomi stared at the receipt in disbelief. She knew she had placed it inside the bag. Seeing it again felt strangely emotional. Not because she needed proof anymore, but because it represented something larger. It represented every moment she had spent trying to convince people of a truth she had always known. Adrian handed the receipt to Naomi. You should have never needed this, he said. The words landed with unexpected force. Several people lowered their heads. The security guard stepped forward. His expression carried genuine embarrassment. Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology. One by one, others followed. Employees apologized. Shoppers apologized. Even people who had said nothing seemed unable to meet her eyes. Naomi accepted every apology politely, but she did not linger on them. Her thoughts remained fixed on the hospital, on Ava, on the hour she had lost. Adrian looked around the atrium. Everyone here witnessed an accusation, he said. Now everyone has witnessed the truth. Nobody responded. The room did not need more words. The lesson had already arrived. And as Naomi carefully placed the receipt beside her daughter's card inside the handbag, she realized something important. They had questioned her honesty. They had questioned her character. But in the end, the only thing truly exposed that afternoon was the danger of judging someone before knowing their story. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the feeling left behind in the atrium remained. Conversations returned in hushed tones. Shoppers continued on their way. Employees returned to their duties. Yet nobody who had witnessed the afternoon seemed quite the same. Naomi Brooks carefully gathered her belongings and placed them back inside her handbag. First the receipt, then Ava's handmade card, then the small wrapped music box. She checked each item twice, as though reassuring herself that everything important was still there. In truth, the handbag had never been the most valuable thing she carried. It had always been what was inside. The card, the gift, the love waiting for her at the hospital. Adrian Kong watched quietly. He noticed the way Naomi handled every item with care. He noticed the exhaustion she could no longer hide. Most of all, he noticed that despite everything she had endured, she had not become bitter. Many people would have demanded more apologies. Many people would have wanted revenge. Naomi only wanted to see her daughter. Miss Brooks, Adrian said. Naomi turned toward him. Yes. Adrian glanced at the clock mounted above the customer service desk. Visiting hours were moving quickly. How far is the hospital? Naomi hesitated. About 25 minutes, depending on traffic. Adrian nodded. Without another word, He motioned toward one of the mall managers standing nearby. The manager stepped forward immediately. Adrian spoke quietly. Arrange transportation. Make sure she arrives as quickly as possible. Naomi blinked in surprise. That is not necessary. Adrian looked at her calmly. Perhaps not. But your daughter has already waited long enough. For a moment, Naomi cannot speak. Kindness had become the last thing she expected from this day. Yet here it was. Simple, quiet, genuine. A few minutes later, a black luxury sedan pulled up outside the main entrance. The manager approached and handed Naomi a card with the driver's information. Everything is ready. Naomi looked down at the card, then back at Adrian. Thank you. Adrian shook his head slightly. You do not owe me thanks. You only deserve fairness. The word stayed with her. Fairness. Such a simple thing. Yet it had been missing for most of the afternoon. Naomi held the wrapped music box against her chest and smiled for the first time since entering the shopping center. Not a large smile, just enough to reveal relief. As she turned toward the exit, she paused and looked back at the crowd that remained. Many of the people who had doubted her lowered their eyes. Some offered quiet nods of apology. Naomi returned the gesture with grace. She understood something they were only beginning to learn. Every person carries a story invisible to strangers. Every person fights battles that cannot be seen from the outside. She stepped through the glass doors and into the late afternoon sunlight. The city stretched before her. Somewhere beyond the traffic and buildings, Ava was waiting for a mother who never stopped showing up. Behind her, the shopping center returned to normal. But those who had witnessed the events of that day would remember a woman in hospital scrubs carrying a gift for her daughter, a crowd that judged too quickly, and a truth that refused to stay hidden. And as the car carried Naomi toward the hospital, one thing remained certain. They had tried to question her worth. Instead, they revealed their own assumptions. And that day, everyone remembered what dignity looks like.